An ordinary flight takes an extraordinary turn when a quiet passenger in economy class becomes the target of rude and dismissive airline staff. But as tensions rise and insults fly, no one, neither the crew nor the passengers, realizes they've underestimated the man in seat 17E. What happens when his true identity is revealed? It shocks the entire crew and changes the course of the flight forever. This is a story you won't believe. Stay tuned to uncover the truth behind the undercover passenger who taught everyone a lesson they'll never forget. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The cabin buzzed with the muffled sound of conversations, the clink of luggage being loaded, and the occasional beeping of the intercom. A faint scent of reheated meals lingered in the recycled air. The man in 17E shifted in his seat, glancing around with an air of quiet observation. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm for the chaos around him. He was dressed modestly, a simple navy blazer and a plain white shirt. Nothing about him screamed importance, yet there was something unsettling in the way his eyes lingered on every detail, cataloging everything in his mind. "Sir, you're blocking the aisle," snapped a flight attendant as she passed by, her arms full of meal trays. Her tone was sharp, her eyes tired. He'd barely moved an inch out of his seat, but he adjusted anyway, offering her a faint, apologetic nod. She didn't wait for a response, brushing past him with an annoyed huff. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather notebook. The sound of the pen clicking open was barely audible, but it felt deliberate, calculated. As he began to jot down something, a curious passenger seated across the aisle couldn't help but lean closer, his brows furrowed. "Are you, taking notes on the flight?" the man asked, half joking but genuinely curious. The man in 17E didn't look up. "Just observations," he replied, with a polite smile that offered no further explanation. The other passenger frowned, sensing the vague response was intentional, but said nothing more. A baby's cry pierced the cabin, and the young mother in 18B was frantically trying to calm her infant. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the pacifier, her voice tinged with panic. "I just need a little warm water," she pleaded with a passing flight attendant, her face flushed with embarrassment. "We don't have time to cater to every single request right now," the attendant said sharply, glancing at her watch. "Maybe later." She walked away without a second glance, leaving the young mother near tears. The man in 17E watched the interaction unfold. Without a word, he got up and quietly approached the woman. He crouched slightly to meet her eye level and spoke softly, his voice steady. "If you want, I can ask them again for you." His tone wasn't just kind. It was authoritative, almost as if he expected compliance. The woman blinked, momentarily stunned by his calm demeanor. I don't want to bother anyone," she stammered. "You're not bothering anyone," he replied firmly. His eyes flicked to the galley where the same attendant stood with her back turned, muttering something to a colleague. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The attendant turned, her expression instantly souring. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. "The passenger in 18B requested warm water. It's for her baby." "Surely that's manageable," he said, the calm in his voice laced with a subtle edge. Her brows shot up in disbelief. "Look, sir, we're busy preparing for service. We can't drop everything for personal requests." He didn't flinch. "And yet you dropped everything to tell me that," he said evenly, his gaze holding hers. There was no anger in his tone, no raised voice, just an unnerving steadiness that made her hesitate. The silence that followed felt heavier than the hum of the plane. With a roll of her eyes, the attendant turned to the galley, grabbed a small bottle of water, and slammed it onto the counter. "Here," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Happy now?" The man didn't respond. He simply took the bottle, nodded politely, and handed it to the grateful mother. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else," he said quietly before returning to his seat. The passengers around him exchanged glances, some murmuring softly. A few nodded in quiet approval, though most were unsure what to make of him. One attendant whispered to another in the galley, "Who does he think he is?" Acting like he owns the place. Back in his seat, the man opened his notebook again, jotting something quickly, before slipping it into his jacket pocket. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder. People were watching him now, curious and uncertain, wondering if there was more to him than met the eye. The flight attendant, who had brushed him off earlier, made a point to pass by his seat, bumping his elbow intentionally as she did. "Oh, sorry," she said, her voice flat and unapologetic. He glanced at her but said nothing, his face betraying no emotion. He returned to his notebook, his pen gliding across the page. Whatever he was writing seemed urgent, deliberate, and it was making people uneasy. The tension in the cabin had shifted, and even those who hadn't noticed him before were starting to pay attention. Still, he sat quietly, his actions small, yet deliberate. Whatever game he was playing, he was in no rush to reveal it. The flight had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Passengers adjusted their seats, fiddled with the in-flight entertainment, or dozed off as the cabin lights dimmed. Yet the tension surrounding the man in 17E hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was spreading. Whispers moved through the rows like static, and even the flight attendants seemed to glance in his direction more frequently, their eyes flicking to his notebook with suspicion. "Is he writing about us?" one attendant murmured to another near the galley. The senior flight attendant, Clara, who had been overseeing the service with a sour look plastered on her face, overheard them. "Why are you worried about that guy? He's just another economy seat nobody," she snapped, her words dripping with disdain. But even as she dismissed him, her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. The man remained unbothered, his pen methodically moving across the page. Then, as if sensing the weight of the stares on him, he paused. Slowly he capped the pen, closed the notebook, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest, and closed his eyes, giving the appearance of someone resting. But anyone paying close attention would have noticed his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest as if he were counting seconds. Clara, emboldened by the apparent dismissal, strode down the aisle toward him. Her sharp heels clicked against the carpet, a sound that made nearby passengers instinctively pull back into their seats. She stopped beside him, folding her arms and plastering on a thin, insincere smile. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone overly sweet. "Is there a problem?" The man opened his eyes slowly, as if she'd pulled him out of a deep reverie. His gaze met hers, calm but piercing. "No problem at all," he said, his voice steady, measured. Clara's smile tightened. "I just noticed you've been taking notes. Is there something about our service that you find concerning?" There it was, a challenge, masked as curiosity. Her question hung in the air, and a few passengers nearby leaned slightly closer, pretending not to eavesdrop. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, his silence pulling the tension taut like a bowstring. Finally, he said, "Is it against policy to observe one's surroundings?" His voice was soft, but there was an undeniable weight to it, like the calm before a storm. Clara faltered, the edges of her confidence fraying. "No, of course not," she replied quickly, but her tone betrayed her discomfort. "It's just unusual, that's all." "I see," he said, leaning forward slightly. The faintest hint of a smile played at the corner of his lips. "Unusual how?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. A flush crept up her neck. "Well, we like to ensure our passengers are comfortable, and we noticed you seemed a bit particular." "Particular?" he echoed, his brow lifting slightly. "Because I asked for water?" A few passengers stifled chuckles, and Clara's face darkened. "That's not what I meant," she snapped, her saccharine tone evaporating. She stepped back, clearly flustered. Just let us know if you need anything." "Thank you," he said evenly, watching as she turned and stormed back to the galley, muttering under her breath. As soon as she disappeared, the retired pilot in the row behind him leaned forward, his voice low. "You've got them riled up, haven't you?" His tone was amused, almost conspiratorial. The man in 17E tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the comment but offering no further reaction. "You're not exactly subtle," the older man pressed, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "You've got the look of someone used to running the show. Military? Corporate?" The man smiled faintly but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, typing a quick message. "Situation developing. Maintaining cover." The retired pilot chuckled softly, leaning back in his seat. "Thought so," he muttered to himself, his grin widening. As the cabin settled again, Clara huddled with her colleagues in the galley, her frustration boiling over. "I don't trust him," she hissed. "He's too calm, too composed. We need to keep an eye on him." "Do you think he's someone important?" one of the junior attendants whispered nervously. "No," Clara said sharply. "He's probably just another passenger looking for trouble. People like that think they can intimidate us. But not on my flight." Her declaration sounded confident, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in her voice that her colleagues didn't miss. Even as she barked orders to the crew, her eyes kept darting toward the back of the cabin, toward the man who had become the quiet center of everyone's attention. Back in 17E, the man leaned against the window, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside. His reflection stared back at him, inscrutable and calm, as though he were waiting for something or someone. The cabin's uneasy quiet was punctuated by the occasional clatter of cups or the murmur of passengers speaking in hushed tones. But the man in 17E sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed ahead, his face unreadable. The retired pilot behind him hadn't given up his quiet observations, glancing every so often, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Around him, the tension was growing, thin and stretched, like the taut strings of a violin. Clara, meanwhile, wasn't content to let things lie. Her irritation simmered just beneath the surface as she bustled through the aisles, checking on passengers with a false cheer that fooled no one. Every now and then, her sharp gaze would dart toward 17E, her annoyance intensifying with each glance. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was playing some kind of game, and she was determined not to let him win, whatever winning meant in this scenario. As the meal carts rolled out, Clara decided it was time to reassert her authority. She made her way to the back of the cabin, her posture stiff, her movements clipped. When she stopped at the man's row, she forced her voice into a tone of exaggerated politeness. "Dinner service," she announced, holding up the tray. "We've got chicken or pasta. Which will it be?" The man looked up at her, his calm expression unchanged. "I'll have the vegetarian option." Clara's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. "We don't carry a vegetarian option in economy class. Chicken or pasta?" He raised a brow, tilting his head slightly. "I requested a vegetarian meal when I booked my ticket." Her smile tightened. "That's not showing on our manifest." "I see," he said quietly, his voice betraying no irritation. "In that case, I'll take water." Clara blinked, momentarily thrown off by his lack of reaction. She'd expected an argument, perhaps even a confrontation. But the man simply returned to his calm, unbothered demeanor, as if her attitude was beneath his notice. She slammed a cup of water onto his tray with just enough force to spill a few drops. "Enjoy," she said curtly, spinning on her heel before he could respond. From his seat behind the man, the retired pilot let out a low chuckle. "Smooth," he murmured, shaking his head. "She's about to explode, and you're just letting her stew." The man turned slightly, his eyes meeting the older man's for the briefest of moments. "Sometimes," he said softly, "it's better to let people show you who they are." The retired pilot nodded knowingly, his smile widening. "You've done this before," he said, his tone half a question, half a statement. But the man offered no reply. Meanwhile, Clara returned to the galley, her patience now wearing dangerously thin. She slammed the empty tray into the cart, startling the junior attendant beside her. "Who does he think he is?" she muttered under her breath. "Sitting there like he's untouchable?" The junior attendant hesitated. "Maybe he's, I don't know, important? What if he's someone inspecting the airline?" "Don't be ridiculous," Clara snapped, though her voice faltered just slightly. "He's nobody. Just a passenger who thinks he's better than everyone else? People like that just like to stir up trouble." But even as she spoke, a flicker of doubt crept into her expression. The man's calm, composed demeanor was unnerving, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested somehow. Back in 17E, the man reached for his notebook again. He opened it to a fresh page, his pen gliding smoothly as he began to write. The retired pilot watched curiously, leaning slightly forward as if hoping to catch a glimpse of what was on the page. But the man angled the notebook away, his movement subtle but deliberate. At that moment, the baby in 18B let out another wail, louder this time. The young mother's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to soothe her child, but the cries only grew more desperate. She pressed the call button, her hands trembling as she glanced around, clearly hoping for assistance. Clara appeared moments later, her expression sour. "What is it now?" she asked, the annoyance in her tone poorly disguised. My baby's sick," the mother stammered, her voice barely audible over the child's cries. "I just need some help, some warm water maybe?" Clara rolled her eyes. "I've already told you, we're busy. There's only so much we can do." The mother's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm just trying to—" "That's enough," came a voice from 17E. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin like a blade. All eyes turned toward the man who had risen from his seat. He moved toward the young mother with an air of quiet authority, his calm exterior somehow more commanding than if he had raised his voice. "She's asking for warm water, not the moon," he said, his tone firm but composed. He turned to Clara, meeting her gaze with a look that was equal parts challenge and expectation. "Is it really so difficult to show a little compassion?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked genuinely flustered. The passengers around them murmured softly, some nodding in agreement, others watching with wide-eyed curiosity. "I'll handle it," the man said, his voice quieter now, but no less authoritative. He gestured to the young mother, motioning for her to follow him toward the galley. Clara stepped aside reluctantly, her face a mix of anger and confusion, as the man calmly took control of the situation. As he returned moments later with a bottle of warm water, the young mother thanked him profusely, her voice choked with relief. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, cradling her now calmer baby. He offered her a faint smile. "Everyone deserves kindness," he said simply, returning to his seat. But as he sat down, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder, their curiosity now fully piqued. Who was this man? Why did he act like someone accustomed to command? And why, despite his unassuming appearance, did he seem so utterly untouchable? Clara, still standing in the aisle, clenched her fists at her sides, her mind racing. Whoever he was, she was determined to find out, and she wasn't about to let him get the better of her. The cabin was quieter now, but the silence felt uneasy, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Conversations were hushed, and the occasional glance toward the man in 17E betrayed the growing curiosity that rippled through the rows. Even those who had been preoccupied with their books or in-flight movies seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Something about him unsettled people, not because he was loud or demanding, but because he wasn't. He remained calm, detached, as though everything around him was a piece of a puzzle he was quietly solving. Clara stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Her colleagues hovered nearby, their voices low but frantic. "He's got to be someone important," the junior attendant whispered, her nervous gaze darting toward the back of the plane. "Nobody acts like that unless they're, I don't know, an inspector or something?" Clara snorted, though the sound lacked confidence. "Important people don't fly economy," she muttered. But her own words didn't convince her. The man's demeanor, his refusal to react to her provocations, the way he had handled the young mother's situation with such ease, it didn't add up. He wasn't just another difficult passenger. One of the other attendants hesitated. "What if he's evaluating us? You've heard the rumors about undercover inspections. Maybe this is one of those." Clara's lips thinned. She didn't like the idea, but the thought had been gnawing at the edges of her mind since the moment she'd noticed him. Still, she wouldn't let herself be intimidated. "If he's an inspector, he's doing a terrible job at hiding it," she said. "I'll handle it. Just focus on the passengers." Back in his seat, the man's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. He had his notebook out again, but this time he wasn't writing. He was simply flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the notes with an intensity that hinted at a larger purpose. Occasionally, he would glance toward the aisle, his expression unreadable. The retired pilot behind him leaned forward again, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "You're not just here for the flight, are you?" he asked in a low voice. The man didn't turn around. "What makes you say that?" The pilot chuckled softly. "I've been around long enough to know when someone's watching more than they let on. You've got the look of someone evaluating." The man in 17E finally looked back, his expression giving nothing away. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his tone light, but with an edge that suggested he wasn't just making small talk. The pilot nodded. "You remind me of myself back when I was flying, always watching, always assessing. It's a habit you never really lose." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. "You have good instincts." The pilot leaned back, satisfied but still curious. "So, what's the verdict so far?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he closed his notebook, tucking it back into his jacket pocket. "The flight isn't over yet," he said simply. The cryptic response only deepened the pilot's intrigue, but before he could press further, Clara reappeared, her presence as sharp and unwelcome as a gust of cold wind. She stopped in the aisle, fixing the man with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir," she began, her tone dripping with false courtesy, "we couldn't help but notice you seem to have a lot of thoughts about our service. Is there something you'd like to share with the crew?" The man looked up at her, his expression as calm as ever. "Your service has been enlightening," he said, his words carefully measured. Clara's smile twitched, her frustration barely concealed. "Enlightening? Care to elaborate?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her, as if deciding whether she was worth the effort. "Not at the moment." Her patience snapped. "If you've got something to say, say it," she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. A few passengers turned to watch, their curiosity piqued once again. The man's gaze didn't waver. "I'll be sure to share my thoughts with the appropriate people," he said evenly, his words carrying a weight that made Clara's stomach twist. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the sudden ding of the intercom interrupted her. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the calm, authoritative voice from the cockpit. "We're experiencing some turbulence ahead, so we'll be turning on the seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats and secure your belongings. Thank you." The timing couldn't have been worse for Clara, who shot the man one last glare before storming back to the galley. The man in 17E returned to his relaxed position, his fingers resuming their rhythmic tapping on the armrest. He seemed entirely unbothered by the exchange, but his eyes flicked to the overhead bin above him, his mind clearly elsewhere. As the turbulence began, the plane shuddered slightly, drawing gasps from a few nervous passengers. The man closed his eyes, his body language relaxed, as though he had experienced far worse. But the whispers around him didn't stop. The passengers were no longer just curious, they were invested, waiting for the moment when this quiet, composed man would reveal who he truly was. Even Clara, sitting stiffly in the galley, couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a storm she hadn't anticipated. The turbulence worsened, causing the plane to jolt sharply. Gasps rippled through the cabin, and a few passengers clutched their armrests with white-knuckled grips. The overhead bins rattled, and a stray bag tumbled out, narrowly missing a startled passenger. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." Clara's voice crackled as she barked orders to her team. "Check the aisles, secure the carts, let's move!" She sounded in control, but her quick, jerky movements betrayed her nervousness. The junior attendants scrambled to comply, one of them barely managing to lock the meal cart into place before it slammed into the galley wall. The man in 17E remained still, his body swaying slightly with the plane's movements, as if he were accustomed to turbulence. His eyes opened, scanning the cabin. The retired pilot behind him, though calm, was gripping his armrests, his eyes flicking to the wings outside. The man leaned slightly toward him, his voice low. "Do you see something?" The pilot hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just instinct kicking in. Been through worse, but the crew doesn't look prepared for this." The man's gaze shifted forward, settling on Clara as she hurried down the aisle, her frustration mounting. Her eyes darted toward the passengers, but her movements lacked focus. She passed by the young mother in 18B, who was visibly struggling to calm her now screaming baby, her own face pale with fear. The man's jaw tightened slightly as he watched Clara breeze past her without so much as a glance. A sharp jolt caused the plane to dip suddenly, and a collective gasp filled the cabin. Overhead compartments creaked ominously, and a few drinks spilled onto tray tables. Somewhere toward the front of the plane, a passenger screamed, setting off a wave of panic. Clara froze, turning back toward the galley, her composure teetering on the edge. "Excuse me," the man in 17E called out, his voice firm but steady. Clara stopped, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face him. "What is it now?" she snapped, louder than necessary. A few passengers looked up, their expressions a mix of fear and irritation. "You missed her," he said, tilting his head toward the young mother struggling in 18B. "She needs help." Clara's jaw clenched. "We're in turbulence," she said sharply. "Everyone needs to stay seated, including you." "She's in distress," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You can't ignore that." Clara's frustration boiled over. "Are you giving me orders now? You think you know how to handle this better than me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood slowly, bracing himself against the seat back in front of him as the plane shuddered again. His movements were controlled, purposeful, and every eye in the cabin seemed to follow him as he took a step into the aisle. "What are you doing?" Clara hissed, her voice rising. "Sit down." He turned to her, his gaze piercing. Passengers look to the crew for reassurance. If you're panicking, they panic. If you're indifferent, they lose trust. Right now, they need calm leadership, and that's not what you're giving them. The words hit like a slap, and Clara's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "You don't know anything about running a flight," she snapped, but her voice faltered. "Don't I?" His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it made her pause. Ignoring her protests, he crouched beside the young mother, who looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You're doing great," he said softly, his tone reassuring. "Let's focus on calming your little one. Do you have anything he likes? A toy? A bottle?" The mother nodded shakily, fumbling in her bag. The man took the bottle from her and handed it back after a moment. "Hold him close, just like that. He's scared because of the noise and movement, but he'll settle if he feels you're steady. You're doing exactly what he needs." She nodded again, her breathing slowing as she followed his instructions. The baby's cries began to soften, and the tension in the immediate area seemed to ease. A few passengers let out quiet sighs of relief. Clara was frozen in place, her hands clenched at her sides as she watched the scene unfold. Her usual sharp retorts seemed to have vanished, replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. The man straightened, his movements deliberate, as he turned back to Clara. "This isn't about the turbulence. It's about how you handle it. The passengers need to see that you're in control, even when you aren't." Before Clara could respond, another voice called out from the front of the cabin, "Help! Somebody help!" A middle-aged man had collapsed in his seat, his head lolling to one side. Gasps erupted around him, and the murmurs of panic began to swell. Clara's eyes widened as she looked toward the galley, clearly unsure of what to do. "Get the medical kit," she shouted to the junior attendants, but her voice lacked the authority it usually carried. The man in 17E didn't wait for permission. He was already moving toward the commotion, his expression sharp and focused. "Stay calm," he said to the passengers nearest the man. "Give him some space." The retired pilot watched him go, a knowing look spreading across his face. He leaned back in his seat, muttering under his breath, "Now we'll see who he really is." The cabin descended into chaos as murmurs of panic swelled to audible concern. Passengers craned their necks to see the man who had collapsed, and several began pressing their call buttons, their faces a mixture of fear and helplessness. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her confidence unraveling as she watched the scene escalate beyond her control. The junior flight attendants fumbled with the medical kit, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. "Out of the way," the man from 17E said, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising noise. He was already by the collapsed passenger's side, crouching with calm precision. His tone was so authoritative, so certain, that even Clara didn't argue, as she hesitated near the aisle, momentarily paralyzed. The man leaned in close, checking the passenger's pulse with steady fingers. "Sir, can you hear me?" His voice softened, a careful contrast to the storm of panic swirling around him. The passenger didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. "He's breathing," the man announced, to no one in particular, though his voice carried to the nearby rows. "But it's shallow. Does anyone here have medical training?" He scanned the cabin, his sharp gaze sweeping over the stunned passengers. A woman in her mid-40s hesitated before raising her hand. "I'm a nurse," she said, standing slowly. "Good," he replied, motioning her forward. "Help me stabilize his head. Do you know his medical history?" The woman shook her head, glancing nervously at the flight crew. Clara, still rooted to her spot, blurted, We don't know. He didn't declare anything when he boarded." The man didn't respond to her, his focus already back on the patient. "He's likely dehydrated or having a cardiac episode. We need to get him oxygen." He turned toward the galley, where the junior attendant stood clutching the medical kit, like it might bite them. "The oxygen mask," he said, his voice firm. "Now." One of the attendants jumped into action, fumbling to retrieve the equipment. The nurse knelt beside the man, assisting in placing the mask over the unconscious passenger's face. The sharp hiss of oxygen filled the air as the mask inflated. The man in 17E glanced at his watch, timing the passenger's shallow breaths. "It's stabilizing," he said to the nurse, "but he needs medical attention as soon as we land." Clara finally found her voice. "We'll alert the captain," she said, turning toward the cockpit. Her movements were jerky, her usual confidence shaken by the calm, commanding way this passenger had taken charge. As Clara disappeared, the man leaned back slightly, addressing the nurse in a quieter tone. "He'll be okay for now, but we need to keep him warm and monitor his breathing. Stay with him until the medics board." The nurse nodded, her demeanor steadying under his calm guidance. Around them, the passengers began to relax, some murmuring their relief, others stealing glances at the man who had just taken control of the situation. He exhaled slowly, rising to his feet and brushing his hands against his jacket. As he returned to his seat, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. The man gave no acknowledgement, settling back into 17E as though nothing had happened. The retired pilot behind him chuckled softly, leaning forward again. "You handled that like someone who's done it 100 times," he said. "Let me guess, doctor? Military? You're not a regular passenger, that's for sure." The man didn't turn around. "I'm here for observation," he said simply, his tone offering no further explanation. The pilot smirked. "Observation, huh? Seems to me you're running the show." At that moment, Clara returned, her expression a storm of emotions. She was visibly rattled, her usual sharp demeanor dulled by a newfound unease. She stopped at the man's row, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Sir," she began, her voice tight, "we appreciate your assistance, but you need to remain in your seat for the rest of the flight. The safety of the cabin is our responsibility." The man tilted his head slightly, studying her for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally, his tone polite, but laced with something that made her shift uncomfortably. "It is your responsibility. Make sure you don't forget that." Clara's face flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned on her heel and marched back to the galley. Around her, passengers exchanged looks, whispering among themselves. Back in his seat, the man reached into his jacket and retrieved his phone. He typed a brief message. "Mid-flight incident handled. No further complications. Maintaining cover." He put the phone away, leaning his head against the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, calm and composed. But his eyes betrayed a hint of something deeper, a watchfulness that hadn't dimmed since the moment he'd boarded the plane. Around him, the cabin began to settle, but the storm he had stirred wasn't so easily calmed. Clara's glares grew sharper with every glance she cast his way, and the whispers from the passengers only grew louder. Whatever they thought about him, one thing was certain. He was no ordinary passenger, and the truth was inching closer to the surface. The cabin's false calm returned, but it felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice over deep, unsettled waters. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at the man in 17E. The mystery surrounding him had taken on a life of its own, and every small action he made, folding his hands, glancing at his watch, even closing his eyes, seemed to deepen the speculation. Clara, still rattled, retreated to the galley and leaned heavily against the counter, her arms trembling. One of the junior attendants approached her cautiously. "Clara, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Clara's eyes narrowed, her frustration spilling over. "No, I'm not okay. Who does that man think he is, taking over like that? He made me look incompetent in front of the entire cabin." The junior attendant hesitated. "I mean, he kind of saved that passenger's life." Clara's head snapped toward her, her expression hard. "That's not the point. It's not his job. It's ours. And now everyone thinks he's the hero." The junior attendant took a step back, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe he is someone important. Did you see how he handled the whole thing? It was like he's done this before." Clara waved her off. "I don't care who he is. He's still just a passenger, and passengers don't run the show." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "But I'm going to find out exactly who he thinks he is." She stormed out of the galley, her jaw tight as she marched down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Passengers fell silent as she passed, sensing her agitation. When she reached 17E, she stopped abruptly, her hands on her hips. "Sir," she began, her tone clipped, "I need you to come with me." The man opened his eyes slowly, as if her voice had barely disturbed him. He turned his head to look up at her, his expression neutral. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his tone so calm it only seemed to infuriate her further. "I need to speak with you privately," Clara said, her words sharp and biting. She motioned toward the rear of the plane where the galley offered a semblance of privacy. The man regarded her for a moment, then stood without protest. His movements were smooth, unhurried, yet somehow deliberate, as though every step was calculated. He followed Clara toward the galley, the eyes of the passengers tracking him the entire way. Even the retired pilot leaned forward, his expression eager with curiosity. Once they were in the galley, Clara turned to face him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The hum of the plane was louder here, but it didn't mask the tension crackling in the air. "All right," she said, her voice low but firm. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'm a passenger," he said simply. "Don't give me that," Clara snapped. "You've been watching everything since the moment you boarded. You're taking notes, stepping in where you don't belong, acting like you're in charge. So I'll ask you again. Who are you?" He regarded her in silence for a moment, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. Clara's breath hitched as her mind raced, her imagination conjuring everything from a badge to something far worse. But when his hand emerged, it held only his sleek leather notebook. He opened it slowly, flipping to a page near the middle. Clara's eyes darted to the handwritten notes, columns, observations, lists, each one meticulously organized. Before she could read too much, he closed the book and returned it to his pocket. "I'm here to observe," he said finally, his voice measured. "Observe what?" Clara demanded, her frustration mounting. "The crew? The passengers? Are you some kind of inspector?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly against the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "What do you think?" he asked, the question deliberate. Clara's composure cracked further. "If you're here to test us, then just say it," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm doing my job the way I've always done it, and I don't need some undercover critic looking over my shoulder." The man's faint smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The way you've always done it," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Interesting." Clara's face flushed, her frustration giving way to a flicker of unease. Before she could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've been granted priority landing due to a medical emergency on board. Please remain seated as we prepare for our descent." Clara exhaled sharply, the announcement cutting through her thoughts. She straightened, her professional mask snapping back into place. "Fine," she said stiffly. "We'll talk more after we land." The man nodded once, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Of course." As Clara turned and marched back into the cabin, her shoulders stiff with tension, the man remained in the galley for a moment longer. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and typed another message. "Final phase approaching. Prepare for debrief." Slipping the phone back into his pocket, he returned to his seat, where the retired pilot gave him a knowing look. "She didn't like whatever you told her," the older man said with a grin. The man allowed himself the faintest chuckle. "She'll understand soon enough." The plane began its descent, and though the cabin grew quieter, the tension remained palpable. The passengers were no longer simply curious, they were waiting. Something was about to happen, and whatever it was, it seemed tied to the man in 17E. Even Clara, fuming silently in the galley, couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully controlled world was about to unravel. The plane touched down with a shudder, the tires screeching against the runway. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin as passengers unclenched their hands from armrests and seatbelts. The announcement from the captain was brief and procedural. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Medical personnel will be boarding shortly to assist a passenger. We ask that you remain seated until instructed otherwise. Thank you for your cooperation." All eyes were on the man in 17E as he sat motionless, his calm demeanor unshaken. Clara stood near the front of the cabin, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her frustration simmering beneath her professional exterior. She had spent the descent replaying their conversation in the galley, her growing unease battling with her pride. Whoever he was, he had managed to throw her completely off balance. The moment the plane's engines powered down, a team of medics boarded, their brisk efficiency cutting through the lingering tension. They moved swiftly to the collapsed passenger, who was now being closely monitored by the nurse. As they worked, Clara approached the man in 17E one last time, her expression a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "Sir," she said, her voice low but firm, "I need to know, are you going to file some kind of report? About me? About this crew?" The man glanced up at her, his calm gaze meeting hers. He didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. Finally, he stood reaching into his jacket and pulling out a sleek black leather wallet. With a single, fluid motion, he flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed under the cabin lights. "Inspector Alexander Grant," he said evenly. "I'm with the Federal Aviation Oversight Authority." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's eyes widened as the realization hit her like a wave. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Behind her, the junior flight attendants exchanged shocked glances, their faces pale. The passengers, who were close enough to see the badge, gasped softly, leaning forward to catch a better look. Grant's voice remained calm, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "This was an unannounced evaluation," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I was here to observe the airline's standards of service, passenger safety, and overall crew conduct. My findings will be included in my report, which will be reviewed by your management and, if necessary, regulatory authorities." Clara's face flushed crimson. I didn't realize," she stammered, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of his words. "That was the point," Grant said simply. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone left no room for argument. "A good crew should treat every passenger with respect and professionalism, regardless of who they are or what they look like." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing for something to say, but the passengers around her weren't as silent. A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin, a few claps breaking out from the rows. Even the retired pilot leaned into the aisle, grinning broadly. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath. Grant turned his attention to the junior attendants, who stood frozen, their expressions equal parts fear and admiration. "To those of you who remained professional under pressure, your efforts were noticed," he said, his gaze softening slightly. "Keep that up. It will take you far." The young attendants nodded quickly, their relief evident. Clara, meanwhile, seemed rooted in place, her confidence now entirely shattered. Grant turned back toward the cabin, his calm eyes sweeping over the passengers. "Thank you for your patience and cooperation during this flight," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I'll ensure my report reflects the commendable behavior I've seen from many of you today." With that, he moved toward the exit, leaving Clara standing there, her pride and composure in tatters. The cabin erupted into applause, a mixture of vindication and admiration from the passengers who had been watching the mystery of the man in 17E unfold. As Grant stepped onto the jet bridge, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading a single message. "Mission complete. Full debrief tomorrow." He allowed himself a small smile before slipping the phone back into his pocket and disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind a plane full of passengers who would remember this flight and the calm, mysterious man in 17E for years to come. Inside the plane, Clara slumped into the nearest seat, staring at the empty row where Grant had been. The applause faded, and the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had been tested, and she had failed. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to breathe. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was a lesson she wouldn't forget. For the passengers, however, the story of the flight would grow into something legendary. Who was the mysterious man? What had he written in that notebook? And why did he seem so unfazed by everything? These were questions that would remain unanswered, adding to the allure of the tale. And for Grant, it was just another day on the job. As the plane emptied and life resumed, The events of the flight lingered in the hearts of everyone aboard. Inspector Grant's calm authority and actions reminded them all of an essential truth. True leadership isn't about status or power, it's about empathy, humility, and the ability to rise under pressure. Clara, humbled by the experience, resolved to reevaluate her approach, knowing respect and kindness are at the heart of exceptional service. The flight became a testament to how one person's quiet actions can inspire change. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more inspiring tales and share your thoughts in the comments below.